I never expected a simple touch to change the way I saw her, but when my friend's aunt linked her fingers with mine, without asking, the world around us felt suddenly different. It started on a quiet Saturday evening, the kind that doesn't promise anything unusual. My friend had invited a few of us over to his house. Just an easy dinner, laughter, the usual noise of friends filling the air. I went expecting nothing more than a casual night. But then I met her. She wasn't the sort of person you noticed in the obvious sense. Not loud, not trying to draw attention. If anything, she carried herself like someone who'd long ago stopped worrying about being seen and, because of that, somehow drew every eye in the room. My friend introduced her simply as his aunt, and I remember the way she smiled at me. Warm, effortless, like she was already letting me in on some private joke. She was in her early 40s, though the number mattered less than the presence she carried. There was a grace about her movements, a stillness in her face, and a way of speaking that made every word sound as though it had weight. She wasn't dressed to impress, just a simple blouse and dark jeans. But the way she held herself made her seem untouchable and familiar at the same time. For the first hour or so, I tried to act normal, slipping into the rhythm of the evening. But I found myself aware of her in ways I couldn't explain. The small curve of her smile when she laughed at something my friend said, the tilt of her head when she listened. Everything seemed to reach me, even when I wasn't the one she was looking at. It happened during one of those in-between moments when the conversation fractured into smaller groups. I'd ended up sitting beside her on the couch, not by intention, but because the space had opened and she gestured for me to take it. She was talking with someone else at first, but then the room grew noisier, and somehow our hands brushed. And then, without asking, without hesitation, she threaded her fingers through mine. It wasn't bold. It wasn't a grand gesture meant to draw attention. In fact, no one else in the room seemed to notice. But I noticed. Every nerve in my hand woke up at once, and for a second, the conversation around us turned into nothing but background noise. Her hand was warm, her skin soft but firm, the way someone's touch feels when they don't second-guess it. I turned my head slightly, searching her face for an explanation. She didn't look at me right away. She kept listening to the conversation, nodding, her lips curved in a small, knowing smile. Only then did her eyes flick toward me, just long enough for me to see something. Playfulness, maybe, or something deeper, something she didn't intend to put into words. I didn't pull away, couldn't. All I could think was how strangely natural it felt, as though this wasn't the first time, as though she already belonged there, sitting beside me, her fingers linked with mine. That was the moment everything shifted. After that moment on the couch, after the quiet shock of her fingers lacing with mine, I found myself unable to shake the awareness of her. It wasn't as if she clung to me, or even drew more attention to what she'd done. She simply let go when the conversation shifted, as though nothing unusual had happened. But the impression of her touch lingered like heat pressed into my skin. I tried to focus on the others. My friend was telling a story, laughter echoing around the room, drinks being passed. But my attention kept slipping back toward her. Every detail stood out. The faint glint of her earrings catching the light, the way she leaned back when she listened, her arms folded loosely, posture relaxed but not careless. She wasn't trying to be striking, and yet I couldn't stop noticing her. At one point she leaned past me to set her glass on the table, her shoulder brushing mine for the briefest second. It was nothing, really, something that should have gone unnoticed. But I felt it all the same, a jolt that ran deeper than it had any right to. She had a way of carrying presence into every small movement. Even the way she laughed seemed softer, richer, like a sound you wanted to lean closer to. I caught myself stealing glances. The way her lips curved, the way her eyes held light when she looked at someone directly. And I kept asking myself, almost helplessly, what had it meant? Her hand finding mine? Could have been nothing. A casual, affectionate gesture. Maybe she was just the kind of person who didn't build walls between herself and others. I told myself that more than once. But the more I thought it, the less I believed it. There had been intent in that touch. Not a loud intent, not a reckless one, but a quiet certainty. Later in the evening, when she stood up to clear a few plates, she passed behind my chair. Her hand brushed against my shoulder. Not firmly, just the weight of her fingers grazing as she moved by. I froze, wondering if it was another accident, but the smallest pause in her movement told me it wasn't. She could have walked around the other way. She didn't. And then there was the way she said my name. Once, just in passing, asking if I wanted more water. It wasn't the word itself. It was the way her tone shifted, how my name seemed to rest on her tongue a moment longer than it needed to. By the time the night wore on, I was caught between confusion and a strange pull I couldn't resist. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to know if she even realized what she was doing to me. But instead I kept quiet, watching her, listening, letting the awareness grow inside me like something I couldn't name. I left that night carrying the memory of her fingers in mine, but even more than that, I left with a question that refused to let me go. The next time I saw her, I promised myself I wouldn't overthink it, that I'd act normal, that I wouldn't replay the memory of her fingers slipping between mine. But the moment she walked into the room, I felt my resolve weaken. She carried herself the same way, graceful, calm, a kind of natural confidence that seemed effortless. And yet, when her eyes found mine, there was something there. A flicker of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that we hadn't imagined what had passed between us. It wasn't long before we found ourselves in the kitchen together, away from the hum of voices in the living room. She was rinsing a glass at the sink, sleeves rolled to her elbows, when I stepped in to grab some water. For a moment we stood in that ordinary space, the kind of pause where anything could be said or nothing at all. "You're quieter tonight," she said softly, not looking up right away. I managed to smile, just trying to keep up with everyone else. She turned then, drying her hands with a towel, her gaze steady. "No, you're watching. You notice things." I didn't know how to answer that. No one had ever pointed it out so plainly before. The conversation stretched from there, easy but strangely deep. She asked about my studies, my plans, not in the shallow way people sometimes ask, but with real interest. And when I answered, she listened, really listened, as though nothing else in the world mattered in that moment. Somewhere in the middle of it, she shared something of her own. A story about traveling in her 20s, about chasing a dream that didn't unfold the way she'd hoped. Her voice softened as she spoke, not regretful exactly, but touched with a kind of honesty people usually guard. "You learn," she said quietly, "that sometimes it isn't about the places you get to, it's about who you become along the way." I found myself leaning closer without realizing it, pulled in not just by her words but by the way she said them. Her hand brushed against mine when she set the towel aside, and though the touch was brief, it was enough to pull every thought in my head into focus. We both laughed then, lightly, as if catching ourselves standing too close. But the space between us didn't widen much. If anything, it felt more fragile now, as though some invisible line had been drawn and we were both circling it carefully. When someone called her name from the other room, she smiled, almost apologetically, and stepped away. But as she passed me, her hand grazed mine again, this time lingering just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It wasn't bold. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate enough to leave me wondering if she was telling me something through these fleeting touches, or if I was reading into them more than I should. Either way, I knew this much. I couldn't go back to pretending she was just my friend's aunt. The more time I spent around her, the heavier the silence inside me grew. Not the silence between us. That was alive, charged with something unspoken, but the silence of what I wasn't admitting to myself. She was my friend's aunt. That fact kept circling back like a warning bell I couldn't shut off. Every glance that lasted a little too long, every touch that lingered, each one pulled me toward her. And yet, every time, a voice in the back of my head whispered about boundaries, about consequences. It wasn't just the age difference, though that thought crept in too. She carried more years than I did, more stories, more lived experience. That gap didn't make her distant, it made her fascinating. But I knew others wouldn't see it that way. To them, it would be strange, maybe even laughable. To me, it felt disarmingly natural. One evening, as everyone gathered in the living room, I caught her watching me across the space. She wasn't staring outright, just a passing glance while she listened to someone else talk. But when our eyes met, neither of us looked away quickly enough. My chest tightened. I forced myself to break the connection, afraid someone might notice the quiet current running between us. I told myself I should pull back, that I should put space between us before the lines blurred any further. But it was already too late. Every small gesture stayed with me. The brush of her hand when she passed me a plate. The subtle way her shoulder leaned toward mine when we sat close. The faint perfume she wore, floral and warm, that seemed to cling to me long after she'd left the room. And then there was the way she sensed me. At dinner, when a conversation turned into teasing at my expense, I laughed along with the others, pretending it didn't bother me. But she must have noticed the flicker in my expression. Beneath the table, her hand found my arm, just briefly. Not enough for anyone to see, but enough to steady me. Her touch was soft, almost protective, and the smallest squeeze of her fingers told me she understood. That moment haunted me, not because it crossed some obvious line, but because of how much it mattered to me that she noticed, that she cared. I wanted more of it, and wanting more felt dangerous. The conflict grew louder each time I caught myself thinking about her when I was alone. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She belonged to a part of life I wasn't supposed to reach into. And yet, every time we shared a glance, every time her hand lingered near mine, the quiet walls I tried to build inside myself kept crumbling. I didn't know where this would lead. All I knew was that I was already too far in to pretend it was nothing. And that frightened me more than I cared to admit. The night was nearly over when it happened. People were beginning to gather their things, saying their goodbyes in clusters by the door. Laughter spilled into the hallway, muffled by the shuffle of jackets and shoes. I lingered, not in any rush to leave, but also not sure why my chest felt so heavy with anticipation. She appeared beside me, as if she had been waiting. "You're walking home, right?" she asked, her voice casual but carrying a certain softness. I nodded. "Yeah, just a few blocks." Her smile curved gently. "Then I'll walk with you. I could use some air." It was nothing dramatic, just a simple decision, but it shifted the world around me. Soon we were outside, the door closing behind us, and the night opened up. The cool air met my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and late summer leaves. Streetlights glowed in patches along the sidewalk, and the city felt quieter than usual, like it had chosen to step aside for us. At first, our steps filled the silence. Side by side, not quite touching, yet close enough that the warmth of her presence felt unmistakable. The sound of our shoes against the pavement kept a rhythm, steady and unhurried. "You're different," she said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I glanced at her. "Different how?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Most people, they move too quickly through conversations. They don't sit in the pauses. You notice things others don't." Her lips lifted slightly, not quite a smile, more like an admission. "I like that." Her words sank into me, warm and unsettling all at once. I wanted to tell her she was the one I couldn't help but notice, but the words tangled on my tongue. Instead, I let the quiet stretch again, heavy with what neither of us said aloud. A breeze lifted strands of her hair across her face. Without thinking, I almost reached to tuck them back, but I stopped myself. She noticed, though. I could tell by the way her gaze flicked toward me, lingering just long enough for the restraint between us to feel fragile. It happened naturally, almost the way it had that first night. Her hand brushed mine as we walked, once, twice, and then she caught it, holding on. This time there was no question, no accident. Her fingers slid between mine deliberately, like she was claiming the space she wanted. I looked at her, half afraid of what I might find in her expression. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking ahead, her face calm, though her thumb pressed gently against my hand as though to reassure me. The world around us blurred. The glow of street lamps, the faint hum of cars in the distance, the cool wind against my skin. All I felt was her hand in mine, steady and unshaken, as though it had always belonged there. And for the first time, I stopped wondering if I had imagined it. She had chosen this, chosen me. We slowed our steps without meaning to, as though the night itself wanted to stretch this moment as far as it could go. Her hand was still locked with mine, warm and certain, her thumb moving in the smallest circles against my skin. That tiny gesture was enough to undo me. I kept glancing at her, searching for something. Maybe an explanation, maybe the courage to speak, but she kept her eyes forward. The glow of a street lamp brushed her profile, softening her features. She looked calm, almost serene, but I knew enough by now to sense there was something beneath it, something carefully held back. We stopped near a quiet corner where the sidewalk bent around a row of trees. The world felt tucked away there, shielded, private. I didn't mean to speak, but the words pressed against me until I let them out. "You know," I said quietly, "I can't stop thinking about the way you held my hand that first night." Her head turned slightly, her expression unreadable in the half-light. She didn't let go. "I wondered if you would bring it up," she said. There was a pause, heavy but not uncomfortable. My heart was racing, the kind of rush that made me feel both reckless and alive. It meant something to me, I admitted. More than I could explain. Her lips parted like she was about to respond, then closed again. She looked down at our hands, still joined, her thumb pressing more firmly into my palm. "You're not the only one," she said at last, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Something in me loosened then. The doubt I'd carried, the fear I was imagining this, that I was reading into shadows, finally broke. She felt it too. I took a breath, steadying myself. "Why though? Why me?" Her laugh was quiet, almost self-conscious. She shook her head slightly, looking up at the dark stretch of sky above us. "Because you see me," she said simply. "Not as somebody's aunt. Not as someone older or out of place. You look at me like I'm still alive. And I can't tell you how long it's been since I felt that." Her honesty struck me harder than anything else could have. The way her voice wavered, just faintly, betrayed a vulnerability I hadn't expected. I wanted to say the right thing, something that matched the weight of what she had given me. Instead, I stepped closer, letting the closeness answer for me. "You make me feel alive too," I whispered. Her eyes found mine then, and for the first time there was no holding back. The playfulness I'd seen before was gone, replaced by something rawer, more exposed. We stood there, our hands locked, silence folding around us. She didn't move away, neither did I. In that fragile, breathless space, everything between us shifted from suggestion to certainty. And in her gaze, I saw not hesitation, but recognition. Like we had finally admitted what both of us already knew. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged, the kind that says more than words ever could. We stood under the soft halo of a street lamp, our hands still interlaced, the night folding around us like a secret. I could hear the faint rush of cars in the distance, the rustle of leaves stirred by a late breeze. Everything else faded, the world, the rules, the invisible lines I had been so careful not to cross. What remained was her, standing in front of me, her gaze steady and unguarded. "I don't know what happens next," I said finally, my voice quiet but certain. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though not unkind. "Neither do I." There was something liberating in that admission. For once, we weren't trying to predict, to explain, to justify. We were simply standing in the truth of what we felt, fragile and undeniable. She squeezed my hand gently, her fingers tightening as if to anchor the moment. "But I do know this," she said, her eyes searching mine. "I don't want to pretend it isn't there. Not anymore." I felt a rush of relief, of gratitude, of something deeper than desire. Something that reached into me and settled in my chest. I nodded because there was nothing else to do but agree. Me neither. The choice of where the story might end depends on the tone it wants to carry. Sparkles together and secure. We began walking again, slower this time, but with no distance between us. Her hand remained in mine all the way back, no longer hidden, no longer a secret meant only for stolen moments. When we reached my door, she didn't rush away. She lingered, her eyes soft, and when she leaned close to kiss my cheek, it felt less like goodbye and more like the start of something we both had chosen. Sparkles together but uncertain. We stood there at the corner, unwilling to move, as if stepping away might break whatever fragile spell we had allowed ourselves to enter. She smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "Life has a way of complicating things," she whispered. I nodded because we both knew it was true. Still, when she leaned into me and rested her head against my shoulder, I wrapped my arm around her without hesitation. Maybe the future was uncertain, but in that moment we belonged exactly where we were. Sparkle's lasting impact, bittersweet. She was the one to loosen her hand first. Not abruptly, but gently, with care, as if she didn't want to bruise the moment. "We'll carry this," she said, her voice low, almost breaking. "Even if it can't be more." She smiled then, though her eyes glistened in the dim light. And as she stepped back, leaving me with the cool night air and the memory of her hand in mine, I knew she was right. Some connections don't fade, no matter where they lead or don't. No matter which path the story takes, it closes with a truth. Their connection had changed them both. What began as a simple gesture, her fingers linking with mine without asking, had unfolded into something neither of us could deny. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never be the same again. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more slow burn romances like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have held on to her hand or let go? I'd love to hear what you think.